Hello everyone, this is a plug for a conference that Augustine College is holding at Pepperdine University, October 20th to 25th. It's going to be on the question of evidence-based medicine, which applies more broadly to the university as well. You can find details at cmda.org. As is our wont, it will be more relaxed than many conferences, which allows you to make many more friendships. I hope to see you there. I've been thinking about some comments I've had and have decided to make a habit of starting my podcast with the Psalms, since I use them every day. And if you don't, I thoroughly recommend it. I've never been troubled by anxiety, and I suspect a lot of it is to do with the way I was brought up and the way the scriptures have been formed in my life. So I just want to read a bit of a psalm, not the whole psalm, as a kind of introductory prayer. O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be as light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. You formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. I try every morning when I wake, first to say the Lord's Prayer, and then when I get up to read a psalm. It sort of gives structure to a day. And as I was thinking about the requests that made me think about slightly changing the way I run this podcast, I realized I think I was wrong. I was concerned that folk would think that I was pushing faith. Well, I don't do that, because faith is a gift. I can only talk about it, bear witness to it in my life. And I can tell you that if you search, you find, but it might take 10 years. Who knows? But it gives structure to life and makes life easier. I came across just the other day an email from a friend who had been at an event where I gave a eulogy for my good friend Ed Blado. Ed was an amazing man, brought up in the Ottawa Valley on a farm. His father died at a critical point, so he couldn't go off to a further education because he had to keep the farm going while his younger siblings grew up. So he didn't actually start his education till quite late in his 20s. And initially he went off to a Bible school in Chicago, the Emmaus Bible School. And by the grace of God, there was a guy there teaching Greek who realized that Ed had an incredible capacity for languages. And he said to him, look, you need to get a real education because you've got real talent. Don't just think that you're a country boy. So he got into the University of Toronto and did a classics degree. Of course, shortly you won't be able to do that anywhere. But when that was finished, didn't know what he really wanted to do, so he got on a boat and went to Europe, and then wandered around visiting German universities where philosophy and classics are still being taught. He ended up getting a PhD, I think it was from Würzburg. Then went off to the Middle East for a while to teach in the American University in Beirut. He was married during that period to a lady from an aristocratic background, so a very unlikely pair in many ways, but they were a wonderful pair. And he, at one point, drove with his family all the way through the Middle East and Turkey and across Europe in a beat-up old van to get to England. If Ed said he would do something, you didn't need to remind him. Every morning when he got up, he would read the scriptures in the original language. He was a wonderfully humble man. He was also an incredible stoic. He once drove himself to hospital with a perforated gut. I don't know many people who could do that. I miss him greatly because he was a kind of rock in a world that doesn't have many rocks. His wife was as amazing as him in different ways. She did two really interesting things. She bred dogs with inborn errors of metabolism for vets to use for exploring reality, and she collected and bred beautiful irises. Both are now gone, but it was a blessing to have them in my life. To see a man who was genuinely humble, with nothing to be humble about. Such was Ed Blado. And his commitment to the scriptures was central. And then just this week, I saw James Tour, one of the world's greatest chemists, certainly in the top 10, and John Lennox, Professor Emeritus in mathematics from Oxford, doing a dialogue together on YouTube. And James Tour says to John Lennox, "I don't suppose you could guess what is the greatest treasure in my life?" And John Lennox smiled. He said, "Oh, I'm sure I know what that is." And of course it was the scriptures. Those two men are both deeply rooted in Scripture. And if you're not rooted somewhere, the metaphor is worthwhile. You're deracinated, you're derooted. And a plant that's lost its roots is blown away by the first wind that comes along. We're living in a world at the moment that doesn't have any roots in the Western world, especially the academic world. In the idea of the hermeneutic of suspicion that dominates the physics MB programs is such a silly idea. If you don't have a foundation to stand on, you don't have anywhere to go. We need foundations. When someone says, "You're a foundationist," I said, "Do you have no foundations? If you're an engineer, I wouldn't trust your buildings, would I? Nor your machinery. If nothing can be assumed, nothing can be proved. There have to be some first premises." C.S. Lewis argues that beautifully in The Abolition of Man. And I don't think anybody's improved on that accessibility of Lewis. You can give him to any ordinarily intelligent person who's not widely educated, and with a little effort they'll say, "Oh my goodness, this is really wonderful stuff." Because, of course, the real test of whether you know your subject is, can you explain it to an intelligent child? It's been a privilege to spend a lot of my life with children. They've taught me a lot. So what about these foundational statements? What I realized as I started thinking through it, that, oh my goodness, so many of the things that I treasure from my medical career, of course, when you were able to do something good for someone, that's an incredible privilege. But what I hadn't really thought about, how often that had been because what I said had included not quotations from Scripture, but allusions to Scripture, which meant that the person on the receiving end immediately knew a lot about me, and they were pleased about it because it meant we had a shared ethos. I remember having to tell a woman that her son, who had been difficult to feed and was now beginning to feed easily, was the beginning of the problem, not the end of it. He had a syndrome where he had no appetite control. And those children usually eat themselves to death in their 20s because they're always hungry. And so they just gain weight, 200-pound 2-year-olds. And I said to her, "You've got a very hard row to hoe. It's not going to be at all easy." But once I discovered that she was a Christian, I said, "I think the best thing you could do is not to give him a medicine, but to put on your fridge the last chapter of Philippians, where Paul describes how to deal with anxiety." And I mean, he should have been anxious. He knew he was going to get his head chopped off, but he clearly wasn't. And he explained how he dealt with that. And of course, anxiety is now a major, major problem. If you've got children, especially girls in their teens, they're 25% likely to have considerable anxiety problems. The best approach I know is that last chapter of Philippians. Be honest about it with God. Lay it before him. and then go away and think about better things. But Paul expresses it beautifully. And then he ends up, he says, I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. Note, he doesn't say it was a gift. He learned it because of where he'd been, what he'd done, and how God had turned up in his life. The psalm that I read was from Psalm 139. I was once giving a lecture on ultra-trace elements in, of all places, Chile, in Santiago. And that's things that we need in our diet, but in parts per billion, incredibly small amounts. But you need a little bit of arsenic in your body. There's a cyanide atom at the middle of vitamin B12, and so it goes on. And I was actually talking about vanadium at that point. And at the end of the lecture, as I went out, a young man was waiting at the door to talk to me. He said, hello. And I said, hello, what can I do for you? And he said, you're a Christian, aren't you? I said, yes, but how do you know? And he said, you said so. I said, I don't remember saying anything about faith in that lecture. He said, no, when you were talking about these elements, you said, fearfully and wonderfully made is a reasonable description, isn't it? And I realized that came from the Psalms. My wife and I are trying to understand Christianity. Would you come and have dinner with us? And I said, well, I'm just about to go up into the Andes for another conference, but I won't be back in the city until next Wednesday. And he asked which hotel I was at, and I told him. He said, well, can I pick you up at 5 o'clock and take you to my home for a meal? I didn't think he'd be there, but he was. And when I got to his home and met his wife, the meal was ready, and it was a lovely meal, but they just wanted to talk about how faith can give foundations to your life. I mean, it was the time of Pinochet. There was a curfew. He just about got me back to the hotel and himself back home before the curfew. Just a throwaway line from my point of view. Well, not even throwaway. I used a phrase that came from the Bible without acknowledging it in any way, and there was somebody who was hungry for it at that point. It's amazing, but I could go on for hours along those lines. Wonderful aspect of the Christian faith we don't make enough of. We recognize one another very quickly in conversation, and it's because of the way we use the language. So, the modern stage, we have a whole series of ill-educated people who claim to be educators, who are destroying what everybody knew for certain 15 minutes ago, the difference between a boy and a girl. You didn't need to think about it. It was immediately obvious. A 2-year-old knows the difference. But somebody with a PhD in some studies program doesn't, or at least can't say it in public. That's bizarre. How did we get to such a state? Now, the ancient world, Aristotle, who gave us logic in many ways, he understood the big questions. I usually say the big questions are, where did I come from? In the beginning, what or who? Why am I here? The idea that we all feel oughted at some point. We ought to do that. Your mother says it. You say it to your children, you ought to do that. The implications of that word ought are astonishing. And where am I going? Everybody has anxiety at the end of their life. If they haven't got that straight, it's inevitable. Now, there are brave unbelievers who go out, I hope, to some sort of rest. I don't know. Some of them, the only person I ever heard of in my career who went out of life screaming was a very good British poet, the best since Keats, somebody described him as once, but he was a militant atheist, and he was terrified when he died. He had no pain except existential pain. We're not supposed to live that way. And so we need to think much more about foundations than we are doing, and how we encourage them in children and not destroy them, which is what we're doing at the moment. I mean, I would blow up the Faculty of Education if I could. Take the people out, but get rid of the whole thing. It has been counterproductive. If you think you can teach people how to teach, you never learnt anything yourself. Because moments of learning come when they come, don't they? The prof who gets the lowest ratings on average in student ratings will nevertheless get a few students for whom he is the best in the department. It's easy to get students to like you. Just give higher grades than they've earned and they'll like you if that's what you want. But the student who comes and says, can you help me think about this? And you make his life harder. That's entirely different. And they're grateful. I used to volunteer to teach in the first small groups in the medical program in Ottawa. To get them when they were entirely green and enthusiastic was wonderful. And, of course, the educators had decided that we were no longer tutors, we were facilitators, as though that would make it better. But we're not supposed to teach. But, of course, I didn't need to do anything but ask questions and undermine some of what the Faculty of Education had been doing. On one occasion, at the end of that, 3 months, or I can't remember even now how long the introductory tutorials lasted, but one of the guys in the group of a group of 8 students, I think it was, came to my office and he was angry and he sat down and we talked for an hour or more. But he said, you had no right to take my way of looking at the world apart by simply asking questions. I knew I'd upset him because at the end when they did the evaluations, normally they just tick the boxes, but he'd written an essay on the back of his assessment and gave it to me. He was angry. But we talked for an hour. 3 years later, when he was looking for a reference to get into his specialty that he wanted to do, he came and asked me to write one for him because we had had conversations over those 3 years every now and again. That's real learning, isn't it? I can look back on some of my teachers and remember stretches of what they said almost verbatim. Jesus, of course, is the world's greatest teacher. He never wrote anything down, and he would certainly fail any Faculty of Education approach to learning. But any even half-interested Christian could probably sit down and write down at least 90% of the stories he told and the miracles he did. No modern teacher will get that kind of recall. That's the big problem for a professor, someone like me. I constantly worry away at the issue, what makes something memorable, what makes something change your world. It's not an easy question to answer. So way back with the Greeks, when they were starting to try and put some intellectual structure to the way we live, we don't need that. You will go to primitive parts of the world as I've done, and you can see good families and bad families, and it doesn't relate to what intellectual structure they have. It relates to deeper things of character. But Aristotle realized that the first question, really, that matters is, where did I come from? I usually say to students there are 9 issues that won't be discussed in university, but if you don't have an answer to them, you're going to have anxiety about not having the answer. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? How do I make sense of death and suffering? How can I believe in justice? What can I know so that I know what I ought to believe? You ought to believe some things so that I know what I ought to do. Those 9 questions, we don't even know who first wrote them down, but it was way back, many centuries before Christ. And they described the human condition at one level. So, where did I come from? Aristotle, being the man that he was, understood that you had to have a first step. He talked about the unmoved mover. He also realized that an infinite regress was proof that you'd got it wrong. In other words, the people who ask who made God, that goes on and on forever, doesn't it? Who made? There has to be stop point somewhere. So he chose matter. He said the world is eternal. Everything stems from the matter of the world. And that, of course, was a foundation, and it worked, and it got developed in various ways. The way we understood those things for the next, well, at least until somewhere around about the 13th century AD, Aristotle's approach was held on to, and from it came the fundamental four causes that the world used for many, many centuries as an intellectual structure. About anything that you wanted to describe, you needed to describe what it was made of, what ideas went into its making, skills were required, and what was its purpose? What was it made for? It gave a framework which people held on to forever. The Catholic Church took Aristotle on board and almost deified him. The big change came around, I always say 1277 because it's a date I can remember. But what happened was that the universities were invented by Christians, by the way. The modern university's origins Christian. Catholic, of course, in the 12th century. And what happened was very intriguing because they took on board and Christianized Aristotle to a large degree. The next step that happened was experiment. Now, systematic experimentation with an open mind is the crown jewel of Western science. Nowhere else did it in a systematic way. Western Europe was the only place where it was systematically used. Other people have copied it since. It's not private. It's the only way to go about science. What moves things along is usually development of new techniques. And when the telescope was invented, Galileo rapidly improved it. And there's a famous story of Galileo showing the telescope to a group of physicists who were Catholic priests. Every university was under the control of the local bishop. And one of them said that nothing seen through that instrument could undermine the works of the divine Aristotle, because Galileo had turned his telescope to the heavens and found that the moon was not a perfect sphere, that there were moons round Jupiter. He discovered all sorts of things which undermined the basic Aristotelian approach. And the Catholic physicists of the time were not willing to accept it. It took a while. Just to be fair, it's not just Catholic priests, it's secularists too who have the same phenomenon. We all have commitments that are intuitive and immediate. We don't give them up easily. The idea that disease could be understood by the four humours approach gave doctors something to say, some structure that made them look wiser than they really were. It was disproved quite early on. No, not quite early. It was an early part of the scientific revolution. But it wasn't until the 1860s that grudgingly the doctors gave up the Aristotelian humours, even though it was shown clearly that they were not an explanation, say, for instance, for the cholera outbreak in London. We hold on to our ideas not because they're true, but because they're our ideas. And we need to make our children aware of how real this is, so that we can encourage in them an exploration of the world. Psalm 139 is about exploring the world. Now, Christians with explicit faith, made a huge contribution. I mean, just listen to this list. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. They're all committed Christians. Several of them evangelical in modern terms, others Catholic. Their faith was not a byproduct, it was the foundation from which they started. In order to do an experiment, as I had to go to Africa to actually think about this, you need some prerequisite thoughts. I'd had the privilege of putting together with some other workers in Jamaica the protocols for the treatment of severe malnutrition. When the unit was started after the Second World War by John Waterlow, death rates from severe malnutrition, 10-pound 2-year-olds or worse, was, 40-50%. When the work was finished in Jamaica, and I left in 1979, we went through 100 babies just before I left without losing one. And the treatment was counterintuitive. Maybe sometime I should do a podcast on it because it's quite interesting. But that process had been arrived at by steady experimentation. And the first experiments weren't done until the 14th century in Merton College, Oxford, and they didn't really understand what they were doing. But the idea that you could measure things was very important. See, the old 4 courses didn't include measurement, perhaps in technique, but when we started measuring, we really loved what we got, and then we started to think he could do more than he could. So that led to reductionism, the idea that if it couldn't be measured, it wasn't real. Now, you only just stop and think for a moment to realize that's got to be untrue. You can't measure love, and we all need that. You can't measure the relationship between a parent and child. That's the fallacy of daycare. You only have to ask one question to show the difference between a parent and a professional daycare, trained in child development and everything else. If your professional daycare provider didn't see your child again from tonight, would they lose a night's sleep? If you didn't see your child again, would you lose a night's sleep? That's the difference. And it can't be measured. But it can't be denied. So reductionism, the idea that only what's measured mattered, also led to the loss of teleology, purpose. But we can't live without it. It always creeps. You push it out the front door, it comes back in the back door. It takes a time. One of the guys I most appreciated as a teacher of medicine was a total reductionist. But he really taught me how to think scientifically about medicine, and that was wonderful. And he was a very good man, kind, charitable, and he didn't actually talk about that. He was a reductionist, but then he loved music too. I don't know what happened to him at the end of his life. I hope it was good. It deserves to be. But you can't measure purpose, but you can't do without it. And of course, God has his ironic revenge, particularly in an area I know a little bit about, molecular biology. DNA was first derived in 1953. I was just a teenager. It took a little while for Crick to announce what it was doing, but in fact, Crick wasn't the first there. I'm told that there was a physicist there right at the beginning who, when he saw what they'd done, he said, this has got to be a code. It took a year or two for Crick to work his way through that. But yes, the DNA is a coded message. It doesn't make anything, does it? It's a library of blueprints, if you like, an incredible library, but it's written in code. There are only 4 letters in the code, and the words only work in triplets. Start, stop, and amino acids all have triplets to designate them. And you need about 300 triplets in order, a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but something of that order, approaching 1,000 letters in order to get a single protein. What's the probability of that happening by chance? Well, the mathematicians tell me it's very, 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 very small. You had to ask, what does this code do in order to start beginning to understand what was going on? And it just gets worse and worse from then on. The idea that the information contained in DNA could happen by chance is unbelievable. That's an act of faith of an order of magnitude that no Christianity ever requires of you. But lots of people believe it because Darwin said it was so, but it isn't so. It gets worse. It gets worse in the molecular biology world, but there's not time to talk about it at the moment. But the other area where it gets worse is the move from inorganic to organic. I talk about this every now and again because I think it's necessary. The probability of that happening. Listen to James Tour on YouTube and you'll get some sense of it. We live in a world where people doing hard physics and hard molecular biology don't want to argue about God anymore because they know there's a lot of evidence in his favor. It makes sense. So that process has been going on for a long while. The question, who or what banged at the beginning, is a reasonable one. And we should teach our children to ask it. Now, with the collapse of the Ivy League precedents and then the recognition that the university had lost its way, that it was becoming a poisonous environment where you could be cancelled for a word that doesn't happen to be approved of by the Marxists who are in charge, even when they don't think of themselves as Marxists. They're totalitarians. And it's destroying us. I was listening just last night to a YouTube discussion with 4 good academics. One I didn't know, 3 I did, whose work I appreciate, some more than others. But when they were asked, what should a university be about? It was amazing how unsatisfying most of their responses were initially. I'll have to go and listen to them again to see if I'm being unkind to them. And I've forgotten their names at the moment. John McWhirter was one of them. Stephen Pinker was another. Kathleen Stock. Yeah, I got 3 out of the 4. No discussion of truth. The word was mentioned, but no discussion about starting with a definition. What is truth? We all know it when we see it. We all hate being lied to. But the university started to be for the glory of God, and truth was seen to be what we would get out of it. His knowledge is perfect and true, and that's what we were trying to find out. Only when you believe the world is made by a God who's ordered does it make sense to do experiments. All great cultures have a great book, a religion, if you like. The biggest one of all is the Book of Nature. And if you're living in the middle of the rainforest and half your children die before maturity and your governments are the worst in the world, there's not immediately an evidence of a God of love, but to say to somebody in a rainforest that this all happened by chance, they won't believe you. No, it was whoever made it doesn't care about us very much. But there's some really amazing mind behind this. We have to stop and think and ask ourselves, what is it that makes this so amazing? But you'll never do an experiment if your answer is evil spirits. Pagan religions which put evil spirits as the proximate cause of the disasters in life make sense of the failures of living in that kind of environment, much better than the Christian idea of a God of love at first sight. But you will never do an experiment if you believe that underneath is just callous nastiness. It's not worth doing. There's no reason with that as your starting base to believe that an experiment done in London and one done in New York will give the same answer. But that's at the base of science, that belief. Now, if you're very fatalistic, as Muslims, Hindus and Buddhists are, again, you tend to shrug when things go wrong rather than say, what went wrong? Have I missed something? Should I learn something? And often it's when you get the answer that you didn't expect that you should actually shout Eureka and say, oh, this goes against what we all believe. I wonder, have we got something wrong? I mean, Newton made a marvelous step forward, wrote the single greatest text in science of all time, but he wasn't completely right, was he? It works well at low G, but it doesn't work for the cosmos as a whole. Einstein thought he got it wrong. Now it appears his correction was probably right as well in a different way. But the mindset of Judeo-Christian thought is very compatible with science. It's not an accident that Jews get 200 times more Nobel Prizes than the whole of the Muslim world, because the Muslim world is fatalistic. That's not going to lead to good science. I hope I haven't upset you too much, but this is the world we're in. I mean, students today in the secular world, increasingly dominated by people who say, I have no real beliefs. Well, they end up, in China, they have a phrase, I can't say it in Chinese, but basically the young people are saying to the government, you can all go and rot. They're not interested in even working very much, a lot of them. And they're certainly not reproducing. That's the death of the culture. There's no country in the Western world that has a thriving family system except Israel, which I put in the Western world. They're reproducing. We're not. We've lost our faith in the future. Why bother? Let it rot. There's no point. That's what young people are saying. And we're not going to solve that problem by teaching them some more science or some more CRT or whatever is the current nostrum of the woke world. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The idea that your life here is not all that there is, and we all deep down know that. And knowing, as the psalmist said, that our thoughts are known to God, and he actually doesn't look so much at our actions but our intentions, as Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount. He's highly motivated. We all need to be motivated. That took much longer than I thought. Hope I haven't bored you. Have a good week.